In the early hours of December 14th, 2025 at around 3:12 a.m., a fuel depot deep inside Krasnodar was operating as a secure Russian rear area until a strike carrying a warhead of roughly 500 kilograms slammed straight into the center of the facility. On infrared screens, the state change signal appeared almost instantly. The primary tank crossed its thermal threshold and exposed pipeline lines lost stability. The alarm sirens activated after that, but the reaction cycle had already been exceeded. From this moment on, this was no longer incident management. The depot had just lost control, and heat began propagating to adjacent tanks in a chain reaction. The Russian rear was not collapsed by massive firepower. It was dragged directly into the war by a loss of tempo. The concept of safe depth was erased. They called Krasnodar an invulnerable rear area, not only because of the distance. This fuel depot sat deep within Russian territory, beyond the reach of artillery and most traditional strike methods. For months, it had never appeared in any emergency report. There was no precedent, no reason to consider it a target. As a result, everything was designed to run on an operational rhythm, not a combat rhythm. Manifolds and pump houses kept fuel flowing steadily into tanker trains. Each loading cycle linked into the next, forming a chain that was not permitted to break. A normal night had no explosions, but it had a schedule. Loading hours, dispatch hours, pressure checks, shift changes. When the schedule ran smoothly, the system was considered safe, and habit began to replace vigilance. Low-altitude surveillance, therefore, ran in a reduced mode, not fully shut down, but active in cycles sufficient to exist on the checklist. Classification thresholds were raised to avoid false alarms and to avoid pulling the entire operational network out of its optimal state. Data continued flowing to the center, but only signals that persisted long enough were allowed to become alerts. On the internal command and control screens, the night interference box was ticked as a habitual gesture. On the other hand, Ukraine did not need to break Russian airspace in volume. They only needed to touch continuity at the right point, at the exact moment when the rear believed it no longer required defense. A low-flying, loitering UAV appeared precisely when the surveillance picture was at its thinnest, and allowed the trust threshold to keep the operator stationary for exactly one more beat. From that point on, the system was no longer proactive. It could only react. At around 2:47 a.m., the low-layer defensive picture over Krasnodar went empty for exactly one beat. Everything still looked in place. Familiar speckled interference, track traces that did not deviate from the previous shift's pattern. Only one scan cycle slipped, short enough not to be flagged, but long enough to open a gap. At the outer perimeter of the depot, a peripheral camera caught a dark shape gliding through exactly one frame. Not enough to identify, not enough to lock. The data arrived, but did not persist long enough to become a target. According to classification logic, the signal was pushed below threshold. Night interference. The classification threshold held the system still for one more beat. The only response triggered was a ground response. A patrol vehicle departed the main depot ring, following the outer inspection route, consuming time. The headlights pulled the reaction outward. The picture still appeared continuous, but true continuity had just been carved out. And when that gap was pierced, no siren could change tempo in time. The gap was open. At around 3:06 a.m., by the time the defensive network began to believe, it was already too late. One camera in the tank yard captured exactly one frame. A black streak flying low, slicing across the lit zone, the edge of the image stretched by speed. Not a bird, not interference. It did not remain long enough for the system to name it, but it also did not vanish like a false alarm. Just one frame, yet enough to shift the phase. The duty room focused on the screen, and the picture was no longer calm. Data thickened in the worst possible way. Anomalous points flickering, out of sync with the scan cycle, failing to form a clean track. One sensor reported a brief oscillation, then went silent. Another feed appeared at exactly the wrong moment, then fell out of the processing window. The picture was not empty, but still not enough to press. The trust threshold held everything right at the edge of decision. The data was there. The order had not yet formed. And every second of not sure enough at this moment was no longer caution. It was time in which the system cut away its own initiative. The duty officer called up the chain, short and urgent. The line on the other end cut it off. Not sure enough. Observe. One more beat was locked in paperwork. The processing chain kept running, but in a waiting state. No elevation of alert level, no opening of additional response channels, no phase shift in control. On the screen, parameters continued updating, but none were allowed to cross the activation threshold. The system stood exactly where it should have turned, and that stillness opened the rest. The target did not choose what was spectacular. It chose what kept tempo, the manifold and the pump house. A point that drew no attention on satellite imagery, not a large tank, not a prominent structure. But in operations, it was the node through which every flow had to pass. Touching it meant touching the entire chain. The strike did not need to be large, it only needed to be precise at the right moment when continuity had thinned. The safety state triggered right at the distribution node. State indicators changed color almost simultaneously across multiple displays. Operating pressure was pulled below the protection threshold. Pump rhythm was cut. There was no soft transition phase. No buffer for humans to step in. Continuity snapped at the source. And everything downstream was dragged with it in the same beat. The foam system activated reflexively, but missed the tempo. Not because of a lack of equipment, but because the control logic behind it had lost its reference point. Pressure was insufficient to maintain coverage. Supply flow was no longer stable enough to lock the fire. The fire did not erupt like a single explosion. It crawled along the pipelines, fed by the conduits, spreading like a chain that had just been switched on. From a localized incident, the depot shifted into a chain state without the need for any additional strike. On the screens, alerts are no longer queued according to early containment. They crowded in under the logic of damage mitigation. Control language shifted phase, from holding tempo to absorbing slippage. They were still talking about confirmation when the system pulled them into a different problem. No longer, can it be stopped, but how long can it be held? The decision had not yet taken shape when the threshold slid into too late. It was not a tank being struck or a fire beginning. It was the rhythm of control being broken at the operational node. Control itself was struck. At around 3:12 a.m., the depot no longer needed another strike. After the touch on the manifold, it transitioned on its own into domino mode, as if the entire facility had been pushed past a threshold from which it could not return. On infrared, the hotspot did not stay in one place. It stretched into a thin, bright band along the exposed pipeline routes, following the depot's operational pathways, and at the same time, the control picture changed meaning. No longer something to decide with, but something barely able to record the spread. Pressure loss, foam shortfall. Heat is climbing past the threshold. Everyone understood these signs, but understanding did not mean rescue in time, because from here, time no longer ran on a human operational tempo. When coverage could not be held, every passing second ceased to be fire suppression and became a countdown. Accumulated heat latched onto adjacent tanks, moving from warm to hot along a slope with no return, and at a certain point, the thermal threshold was no longer on the board. It was inside the material. In the moment, the structure began to change state. Response teams surged in according to familiar scripts because that was all that remained once everything had crossed the threshold. Foam was activated, deployment positions matched the plan, and actions followed the procedure. But supply rhythm was no longer stable, pressure was insufficient to lock the coverage loop, and the intervention window closed while they were doing everything right. From that moment on, the objective was no longer full control. It was only to slow the chain. Then the second blow began. And what made it frightening was that it did not come from outside. No additional UAV, no new explosion to assign blame. The depot turned itself into its own chain. A neighboring tank began to thermally deform. On IR, the heat contour tightened like a locking ring. Internal pressure shifted tempo, slipped out of control, and in a very short beat, it crossed the threshold. When that tank changed state, the pressure and heat wave shoved into the next tank like a domino pushing into the following row. No orders required, no additional strike needed. From there, everything accelerated. On the screens, hotspots split into 2, then 3. Alerts crowded in without order. What could previously still be called an incident now become a chain. Parameters jumped erratically, lost synchronization. Heat rising, pressure oscillating, valve signals flickering and dropping out. Data still arrived, but decisions had nowhere to anchor because thresholds were no longer something to cross. Thresholds had become limits that everything had already passed without noticing. Outside, light from the depot reflected off the low clouds into a long, luminous band, like a signal that could not be hidden. The entire depot complex turned into a streak on the thermal map. Not the scene of a single fire, but the signature of an infrastructure being dismantled by heat. From afar, people did not see a depot on fire. They saw an operational level hotspot, something that could not be spoken quietly, could not be concealed, and could not be handled at a normal tempo. The depot was no longer a depot. It was a coordinate on the thermal map. The depot had been fixed onto the thermal map. When full daylight came, the fuel depot in Krasnodar was no longer seen as a functioning logistics facility. In reconnaissance UAV imagery and low-orbit satellite imagery, the manifold zone and pump house appeared as a void gouged straight out of the layout. The tempo node was gone, leaving tanks still standing like steel shells that had crossed the thermal threshold. On paper, the depot still existed. In real operations, it had been removed from the fight. From that moment on, it was no longer a fuel supply point. It became a point to avoid. Damage did not stop at the flames. What could be seen was fire, loss, emergency venting, and tanks that had lost containment capacity. An estimated 150,000 to 200,000 tons of fuel lost or unrecoverable, equivalent to 250 to 350 million US dollars at market prices at that time. But the most expensive part lay behind it, because the load dispatch chain was cut at the hardest place to replace. The central pumping system, valve clusters, pipeline routes, and the entire control logic had to be re-inspected before anyone dared run a normal tempo. Every day the depot could not operate was not only a depot lost, but 30 to 40 million US dollars in added costs from emergency rerouting, longer haul transport, and supply chain stoppages. In the 24 to 72 hours after the strike, tanker train schedules slipped visibly. Some formations had to stop entirely to await route confirmation. Others were forced onto detours more than 200 to 400 kilometers longer, driving time and cost up shift by shift. Surrounding distributed depots were forced to carry flows beyond design, pushing risk outward across the network, one node compensating for another, and the continuity of logistics stretched so tight that one more deviation would snap it. Russia's response was inevitable. Increasing low-altitude watch shifts, pulling in more short-range air defense teams, rebuilding protection rings around major depots, and tightening classification thresholds. But every patch layer took people, time, and resources away from somewhere else. The real damage was not in the light of the fire. It was in the logistics tempo being broken. And that tempo was paid for in hundreds of millions of US dollars, forces dispersed, and time that could not be bought back. Depth was no longer kilometers. It was continuity. Continuity of the surveillance picture, continuity of decision, continuity of control when everything ran on tempo and was locked by thresholds. The night of December 14th, 2025 in Afipsky did not prove Ukraine had a miracle weapon. It proved that cutting the right short segment of an operating chain could make the entire system slip into a state that required no further strikes. Russia can patch it by adding watch shifts, pulling short-range teams closer to major depots, and tightening classification thresholds so it does not get stuck for one more beat. But the price is always the same. The tighter it holds the rear, the more it must pull forces from elsewhere to buy back continuity. And the question left hanging after that night is very simple. If every major depot must be guarded like a front line, then what will be left unattended? And in how many more beats will Ukraine read that gap?